Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Colleen Waters. I'm from the Ulster Museum in Belfast. And just to continue on from this morning, from the visual thinking skills that we were looking at earlier, I'm going to talk about looking at paintings and what I would do with groups when they come into the museum. Now, this painting in real life is absolutely huge. It would be much bigger than this. Also, you'd be able to see it a lot better actually in the museum. And the first thing I would do would be ask about the context it should be in. They've all been shoved together on walls. They're not necessarily where they should be. It's like having the tigers in the cage beside the penguins. So one way you can get a lot of mileage out of things, just the first question is, where do you think it should be? Who was it for? What is the context of this piece? Now, as I've said, it's huge. And children was a big house and then a palace, a castle, big, they go bigger and bigger, but they don't think church, which is the obvious answer to so it should be in a church. Now, it's 400 years old. Sometimes you give information as well. Because if you guess how old it is and why and how, you can sometimes kind of spend a lot of time. So it's 400 years old. It should be in a church. Can you imagine it in a big dark church? Would it look the same or would it look better? And even in the museum context, people say, well, it would look far more, if it was kind of, how would the church be lit? It would be more impressive in its original context than on a brick wall. It's on a stripped back brick wall in the museum. Then how would it have been lit in a church 400 years ago? Well, it would have been lit by candles, obviously, so that they know that, so is there, what would it look like lit by candles? Well, there's all the dark bits would sort of fade, the wriggly bits would maybe become more sort of like wriggly and squiggly looking, and the light source in the painting itself is a candle. It would have been hung above an altar too, and you can ask them about that would be lit by candles. So it's meant to be hung high. And actually, if you look at the proportions, he's out of proportion. His upper body is far too big compared to his little squat legs, but that's because you'd be looking up at it. When I was studying history of art, our first meeting with our Professor Anne Cruikshank, who was very intimidating, was in the National Gallery of Dublin. So her little band of 18-year-olds going around, and we came to a painting and she said, right, everybody, lie down. And we looked and said, lie down. So we all lay down on the floor, and she said, now you are looking at that painting from the correct angle. It's part of a Rubens altar piece and it should be very high. And that gave you that physical thing. It's a lesson you never forget. That idea of, put it in context. Try and imagine how it should look. Doing things as a class as well is always really good. If the whole class does something kind of together, like taking over the gallery to do a picture. So put it in context. Then for slowing down understanding, I think is an important strategy as well. Instead of saying, what's it all about? Or the question sometimes people ask, first of all, is, how does this make you feel? Would you like to be asked, how does this make you feel? So slowing down, understanding. Going around galleries on your own, if you stop for 30 seconds in front of a painting, it's a long stop. Most people stop for a couple of seconds if they stop at all, because if it's visual, you think you take it in all in one go. So if you've got a class with you in the gallery or looking at an object in the classroom even, spending that time is actually a luxury, and it's something that people usually don't do in life, especially in these days where you just flick on to the next image so quickly. So that spending time, and I would just get them to name what they see in the picture. Big strong man, an old man with a candle, it's night time, somebody usually sees the moon in it, he's got a child on his shoulders. What's the child holding? You probably can't see it very well. The child's holding like a blue ball. There's a cockle shell on the ground, which you can't see at all, and that's in that slide. And then you say, well, is he moving? What's happening? Then you try and work out what's going on. So it's a man. He's a big, strong man. And you get all the different impressions, and then you try and put it together. It's a religious story of some sort. He's a saint. Does anyone know which saint it is? Saint Christopher, yes. Saint Christopher. The name Christopher means Christ carrier. And so you can talk it then, another thing that's transferable to other religious paintings is the idea that saints have attributes. They will be carrying or holding something or doing something that will tell you who they are. So St. Christopher's attributes are that he's a giant. He's meant to be an ugly giant. He looks a bit like Sean Connery or somebody. Some people say Wolverine, some people say Sean Connery. He's got a stick with him. He's got a child on his shoulders, and the child has an orb in his hand. So those are the attributes of St. Christopher. You probably know other ones, that usually to do with their martyrdom. If they're holding a stone, it's St. Stephen. If they've got a plate with eyeballs on it, that's a nice one for the toe. It's St. Lucy, because her eyes were put out as part of her martyrdom. St. Agatha is good too. She has two things that look like pink blancmanges. They're actually her breasts that were cut off as part of her martyrdom. So you can put together your saints from their attributes. And so then, you work out St. Christopher, you tell the story of the sort of like the bad man who became a good man, who became a Christian, and then started to help travellers cross a very dangerous river. He'd spent all day helping other people, and then a small child came and asked him, would he help him across the river? So very reluctantly, he took him and carried him on his shoulders, and as he was crossing the river, the child got heavier and heavier. He thought he would drop the child. He thought that he would drown himself. They got to the other side of the river, and the child said, well, you weren't just carrying a child, you were carrying the weight of the whole world and he who made it. It's the idea that he's carrying the world on his shoulders. As far as journeys are concerned, he's a patron saint of travellers. And I just think it's interesting that if you've got a lineup of saints, an identity parade of saints, and you have to choose the one that helps travellers on journeys, it's the giant that helps the travellers. It's the Superman. Even the fact that people say he looks like Wolverine, who is some sort of action hero, or Sean Connery, who's a generation back sort of action hero, that this idea of St. Christopher as being, you need a giant, you need somebody sort of a supernatural giant sometimes to help you when you're on a journey. And then you can talk about movement in paintings. It seems daft to talk about movement, and how do you get the feeling of movement? Well, the movement in this is because he's not balanced. He's lurching forward. His elbow's coming out of the painting at you. It's meant to be an optical illusion. There's a picture plane, which is the surface of the picture. Then there's a sort of receding, the distance in a picture. We're used to that. The idea it's a hole in the wall, it goes through. But some painters try and bring people out of the painting at you too. So his elbows and upper body is sort of coming out of the painting. And then all those squiggly muscles and wriggly muscles, the S shapes through the picture, the S shape of his elbow. The fluttering cloth, all of that adds to the movement and feeling of movement in the painting. Then, it's a balance between, sometimes you can just be completely innocent of any knowledge of a picture and you can talk about it and you can get a certain distance with it. But you could take this to another level and say, well, putting it in historical context, you could say this is a really good example of Baroque art. And in Baroque, the characteristics are, well, light and shade, yes. Light and shade, drama and theatre, yeah, very theatrical. Movement, S-shaped movements, and realism, a certain realism. You might not think it's very realistic, but compared to saints that have things like gold soup plates above their heads, it is very realistic. And the Baroque art was characteristic of the Counter-Reformation, which was the Catholic Church fighting back when parts of Europe had become Protestant. And they fought back with hearts and minds, music, architecture, art, to win people over, to make Catholicism sort of more relevant in a way, in our terms. So can you see that there are layers of things that you can bring into it? Don't say, but if I said, I'm going to talk to you about Baroque art, well, then you really would go to sleep. So that's the St. Christopher, patron saint of travellers. It's by Jacob Jordaens, who was a pupil of Rubens, and it's from Flanders, from Antwerp, originally. It's a really good one for telling a story. You had this. Some of you had these paintings. This one is one where naming the things in it, well, maybe the table here could tell me what they found in it. Yes, the circle's really interesting too, isn't it? And it is like a world, it could be upside down almost, because a circle, it actually gives you a feeling of that it could be rotated too. That's really interesting. You maybe can't see it that well in the reproduction. I can see it perfectly on the screen here. Although it's very blurred anyway. So it's not like the St. Christopher where he was there up front. That was what the painting was about. This is very atmospheric. So it's Mary on a donkey with a baby Jesus. The palm tree is a symbol of what country, or a kind of a stage prop for what place? Egypt. So this is the Holy Family leave it, with King Herod and the massacre of the innocents. You know how an angel came and told the Holy Family to leave and to go into Egypt. So the Holy Family as refugees, really, going into Egypt. And lots of, if you just Google flight into Egypt or rest on the flight into Egypt, you've got the family sort of weary travellers. Sometimes they're up close paintings of them. Sometimes it's the angel guiding them. This is probably the least, like up close of them. So, I mean, the snake is sort of, a symbol of danger. That would be the dark side. The bridge is broken. This is sort of an Egyptian bridge, with those capital, those pillars. They've left that behind. There's light shining on them. This is the sunrise. Now, the artist Turner, who painted this, was very into atmosphere and weather, and he thought, that the sun was very close to God, and light in the world. I mean, it is a metaphor throughout religions, I think, the idea of light. So to him, that is his star is risen. It's the dawn of a new day. It's the kind of morning star was shining down on the Holy Family, and that it's the birth of the new world. So the world thing is correct too. That whole, and I think even this circular thing. Why did Turner choose to do a circular painting? It's circular underneath as well. It's not just that we've clamped a circular frame on top of it. Compositionally, then you've got a sort of vortex of triangles going into it. And I think if the snake wasn't there, it probably would go round and round more. The way the paint is put on is very thick in places, very thin in other places. If you concentrate too much on the story, then you lose the fact it's a painting, so you're looking at the visual elements, of colour, tone, shape, pattern, all those other things that it's interesting to look at paintings through. But when this was exhibited in the Royal Academy in the 1840s. Turner by then was very elderly. He had made a fortune, or he'd made a reputation anyway, through doing pictures of scenery throughout Europe, going on travels over the Alps and everything, doing lots of pictures. These late paintings, for Victorian taste, would have been very, very blurred and difficult to read. And people even said, he's lost his mind. It's a sign of sort of like an elderly man that is going a bit senile. Whereas these are the things that we, in some ways, value most of Turner's work, because it anticipates the Impressionists, the idea of trying to capture weather, atmosphere, moments, and also using that as a symbolism for the painting and the feeling in the painting. So this is his painting of hope and a new dawn. That's the Immigrant Ship leaving Belfast. If I'm looking at this with children, I talk about how they're all moving. It's a sailing ship, but sails aren't up, so then you notice a tugboat in front of it. This ship in full sail coming into port, and then there's all this like dramas or not dramas going on the dock. You've got the family, the woman. If anybody got this, the woman, sort of weeping, and her baby and her little son, the man with his hat and stick waving goodbye. You've got the Turkish men here with their exotic hats, who are just sort of a bit of local colour, and then you've got the two boys sitting fishing. That whole idea of while other people are having the worst moments in their lives, life just goes on. Does anybody know the W.H. Auden poem, Musée des Beaux-Arts? Where he talks about how the old masters knew that, while martyrs were being crucified or whatever, there'd be, dogs scratching themselves. While Icarus was falling out of the sky, there'd be that man just ploughing away. That idea that's always in our lives when things are happening. And then this one, did anybody get this one? they're shaking hands, so you can't see it. Are they arriving, or is he arriving or leaving? Well, he's obviously leaving. He's going to get into the boat. He's wearing a suit, and everybody else is very poorly dressed in many ways. Again, if you can see the painting properly, you'll see that they're wearing homemade shoes called pamputis, which are made from rawhide, uncured leather. They only last for a couple of months, but they're good if you're climbing over slippery rocks or anything. They're very, very ancient shoes that are wood, but they're still made in this place, or at least they still would have been in the 1930s. They've got these caps, these bonnets with the pom-poms on them. He's got a crisp, woven belt that's hanging down. Does anyone know where this is set? It's the Aran Islands, yes. The man in the suit, now if I'm asking children about this, they say, well, he's a man who actually would have worn a suit for his job, although everybody else would be fishermen or farmers, he would have worn a suit. And he's an estate agent, or he's got the bank, it's amazing how long you have to ask P5s before they actually come up with the fact. I say, if anybody had died, he would know that he would have been with the families. They would probably see him every week, at least once a week. If somebody was getting married, he would have been there. Clues all over the place, and they still. He's a local priest, and it's called Goodbye Father. It's by an Irish artist called Sean Keating. Slán Lít a Athair, if you excuse my Irish, but it's Goodbye Father. And they're saying goodbye to him. They're getting into the Curragh to row back to the mainland. He's retiring. So that's the story of the painting. Another story of it is it's huge as well. It's a really big one. And now it's not big because it would be in a church, but it's intentionally big. Sean Keating painted this very big because he wanted it to end up, in a museum or gallery or public building of some sort. And he was actually making a political statement, he was a very political artist, that these people's lives are really important. It's not the great and the good, it's not sort of portraits of, whoever was, the president or something. He's doing a statement which artists in the 19th century would have done. They would have painted ordinary lives and made them kind of monumental, huge. This is from 1935, Goodbye Father. To get off the paintings and onto something, objects that we have. We don't have all this, by the way. This is just a sort of initial slide. A few years ago, the language teacher from BRA said, we're planning to come to the museum. You must have something to do with Islam. And we don't, actually. Our museum has Western art, and Western art is very figurative, really. Even that focus on narrative that I've just had talking about those paintings. We like figures. We like people doing things. That's sort of important to us. We don't have anything that's really Islamic at all, even in our history collection. And then I thought there's some connection with some of this stuff. There's some Islamic connection. I couldn't quite remember what it was. But what's another word for this stuff? There's these type of ceramics. Another word you might use. You call it your delf. That's delf or China? China or delf. So what country do you think it comes from? China. And then delf would be later. Delf, blue and white copies of China, stuff that are actually not made out of porcelain, would have been made in Delft and other parts of the Netherlands, but Delft in particular. Delft used to be the word for China or anything like that, ceramics. My father, who's from this part of the world, and I wonder if anybody has ever heard this saying before, but whenever we were children, he used to say to us, if we were good, he'd go, "You're as good a child as ever sat on Delft." Has anybody heard that? Where did that come from? Because I think it came from the 18th century, or possibly, and I think the Delft he refers to as a potty, an old China potty. You're as good a child as ever sat on Delft. Anyway, that's completely beside the point. So, China, yes, so the China obviously comes from China, and we have a really good collection of Chinese ceramics. It's called the O'Neill Collection. It was by the British ambassador to China in the 1950s was a man called Sir Con O'Neill, who hailed from this part of the world originally. And Con O'Neill collected Chinese ceramics and he lent them to us for about 30 years, and then eventually the National Art Collections Fund agreed to buy them after his death. So it's fantastic to have them. They're a teaching collection, but it's particularly these ones in the middle. These Ming Chinese things. And it's a story of cross-cultural fertilisation, because they're both Chinese and they're Islamic at the same time. They couldn't have existed without both cultures. There's a close-up of one of the big dishes. The wave pattern round the outside is very Chinese, with crashing waves. The next pattern in the next loop with the arabesques, those flowing flowers. The flowers are quite Chinese. The arabesques are Islamic. The grapes don't really grow in China apart from the west of China, so that became a motif that was popular. It's hard to really separate them out into two distinct camps, but it's a combination of both cultures. It's very dense, the ornament. The Chinese would be into more simple ornaments. If they were doing this sort of pattern, they would do it just white on white, and kind of engraved in white. So it's very dense for Chinese, and it's broken into different segments, which is more Islamic than Chinese. And blue and white pottery did start its life close to Basra in Iraq, as far as we know, until they find some other archaeological evidence. As far as we know, about the 8th or 9th century, the potters in Basra, which was the main centre of pottery, they were trying to copy Chinese whiteware. They didn't have white porcelain clay, so they were trying to copy Chinese whiteware, and they were quite successful. They didn't. It would have been sort of more crumbly clay. It would have just been terracotta, really, that they used. But they couldn't resist decorating it. And they had cobalt in the area, and they ground the cobalt and they painted patterns on. And the writing on this is, I've got it written down somewhere, Gibita, G-H-I-B-T-A, script. And you can see it's the same word twice. And it's lovely, it's happiness. So not just once happiness, but twice happiness. So that's the desire now. You can see that the white isn't very, very, very white. So these are the things that took to make the Ming vases that we looked at. This is cobalt. It's a sort of browny grey rock. You have to use your imagination to think it comes out bright blue when it's fired. And this is the blue. The main mining area at that time would have been just south of Tehran, so it's from Persia. Cobalt was worth more than its weight in gold because it was a very rare element. It became worth that once the blue and white ceramics took off. The other thing is the white kaolin clay, and that's found in huge deposits in Jiangxing in China. Now, they could fire it at the right temperature there, so it melted and it became a very hard porcelain ceramics, plain white. When you combine the two and the desire of the Islamic world to have pattern and colour, then you got the Ming ceramics. Now, the port, Jingzhen is up here, just up here, not far from Nanjing. The main port was down here, just opposite Taiwan. It says it was nice and handy to get the ceramics down to the port. It's about 600 miles by boat and lake and river to get down to the port, and then they would have been exported across the Indian Ocean to past Sri Lanka, and he's still here, and up to the Gulf, to Mecca, to Aden, to the countries also here in Africa as well. The merchants would have been Islamic merchants who were based in the port of Guangzhou, and they would have done all the dealing in the ceramics. So can you see it's sort of the cultural fusion there. And of course, if you have a class, you could ask them, well, what was the route called? Somebody might get the Silk Road. Why was it called the Silk Road? Because of silk, and because of whatever. And was it? And you have the vision. I mean, we all have the Silk Road vision of caravans of camels going to places, stop-off points, cities in the deserts. It's all very exotic. Would you like to have a whole load of china? How could you carry that by camel? How would you get that? So it actually went by the maritime Silk Road instead of the overland by the Silk Road. This is another one of the O'Neill ceramics, and it's a fusion of the cultures in that shape, the moon flask shape, is an Islamic shape. The decoration is a combination of Chinese and Islamic, but you can see that that's from almost like a Persian miniature or something. The delicacy of the flowers and the arabesque, those sort of flowing patterns on it. It's the Yongle Emperor, 1403 to 1424, who really encouraged the production of blue and white ceramics. He also encouraged Islam in the country. He rebuilt mosques that had fallen into disrepair. He was very open to foreign ideas. He loved the fact that these were exotic in their own way because they had different shapes and different density of pattern. The people who bought them also liked the fact that they were not completely Islamic looking, that they had Chinese exotic things in them too. It's a bit like the way we like other food, but we sort of adapt it to our own purposes. That's the one with grapes again. It's a big dish. It's about that size. If you ask a class, how do Chinese people eat? Do they share big plates, or do they have everybody? Knows that they have small plates. They have small plates to eat out of. Even now, little, like they eat with chopsticks, and these large plates are far more Islamic, where you have feasts and where you have people sharing from the same plate, where people will, big dishes. The big dishes were quite alien at this stage to Chinese. There's one of these, now it's not in our collection unfortunately, I think it's in the British Museum, but it has Islamic Script around it. It has Arab writing that says, "May this dish always be full and surrounded by your friends." Which is a lovely thought. Now, taking on the blue and white theme, I mean, that could be a whole project, especially in primary school where you do all the cross-curricular things. You could get into the science of different firing temperatures, how terracotta is porous and leaks if you put water in it, but if you glaze it, that makes it waterproof. But porcelain is the strongest. It's it's fired at the highest temperature. All the vocabulary as well you would get from it. Geography, you could teach everything through that. You could do art follow-ups with BRA. We did blue and white tiles with Islamic Script on them. But you could imagine it would be really good for printmaking. You could do blue and white. You could do the columns just in shades of blue and white. You can cover things in blue and white. You can paint things in blue and white. That's a cement mixer, and a Wedgwood cement mixer by a Dutch artist. And then this is my last slide. You can see the Ming arabesques and the chrysanthemums and roses and everything. And this is by Ai Weiwei, and it was for the art fair in Basel last year, in 2018. And he just made this installation of Chinese Ming ceramics that looked like sort of scaffolding pipes. People were crawling through them and walking walking in between under them and everything. So. It is, whatever you cover with blue and white, it instantly has that, Chinese. I'm sure there's nobody here who doesn't have something blue and white in their house. I'm sorry it was all so one way. Obviously, with this class, you think of the next question, you build up to question, you do engineer it to some extent, you scaffold what you're doing. And it's amazing how much people know. Also, I noticed with groups that I do that, you often have, we have a lot of people of Chinese origins, lots of Chinese people, and then anybody who's other people who are Islamic, and it's lovely. And that idea that the technology and the style and Europe was actually off the map as far as they were concerned, really, because they only had wine and wool, and the Chinese were perfectly able to get their own wine and wool. Europe was, when these ceramics were being exported, there was very little trade with Europe. Though all of European ceramics could owe a lot to the middle people in Iraq, Iran, for then exporting their skills to Europe. So that's the only Islamic thing we have in the museum that I could find. But I think it's a good story, and it could be a fantastic project. Okay, well, I'll hand you back to Clodagh then.